Welcome to this video, and we are going to go into the wonderful and weird of the writing papers for language B. Particularly, we're going to look at the French one, but this video should apply to everybody else. So, welcome, and take some notes maybe as you listen to this. So, first of all, what we are going to look at is looking at the examination expectations and how the assessment is marked. And also, we're going to look at how to decrypt a particular task so we can have a kind of a grip of how we can get those. So stay tuned if you want to hear about those things. So first of all, one thing that you need to be absolutely aware is that your IB course for Language B has got a series of themes that must be tackled during the 2-year course. And what is also absolutely crucial to understand is that different teachers will teach different parts of the course. So it's not a set list. So this is an example that you can find in the Language B guides. What is also important is that as an examination, it tackles the themes that you've seen during your 2 years, as it's an end of year course examination. And also, you've got to know that you will have to have a certain set of texts that can be asked you to be writing about. So some texts are personal, some texts are professional, and some texts are derived from mass text that you can see here on the screen. What's very important to remember is that each type of text has got its own perks and its different characteristics. So it's absolutely crucial that you understand where you sit on why one text may be more appropriate than another text. And we're going to go on to that a little bit more later. So, what's important also to understand is that you are given a number of tasks, and you can choose from the most suitable tasks. The number of tasks may vary, um, but I tend to be actually here you've got tasks that I've actually written in French as if you were doing French B, and you also got what would be the question if you were doing English B. So you've got an understanding about the type of tasks. So following the global COVID-19 crisis, your school has decided to only provide online courses as on a permanent basis for subjects that do not require specific equipment, such as teaching languages and literature. As you are part of the student association, you will explain your point of view and the impact of this decision may have on teenagers' development by choosing one of the following text types. So you've got 3 types of text at the bottom. You may notice that the questions are usually quite specific, okay? And obviously, in a normal paper, you would just get it in the language that you're studying, not in both. That's important to remember. We'll come back to that question a little bit later on. So, first of all, let's try to understand the success criteria for these tasks. Those are things that you can have a look at on the um, screen at the moment. So we are only going to look at the top criteria here. And this is the criteria about language, which bears, in fact, the most marks. So what I've put down here is the list of things that needs to be developed throughout the course in order for you to be successful. And I also put a list of things that I believe would really help your strategies, that would really help you to go over those things. So let's review those a little bit. If we're not going to look at all the levels, we're just going to look at the top marks, so 10 to 12 marks here, as you can see at the bottom of the screen. So what's important for us is to, first of all, notice that there is a emphasis on vocabulary, and that is based on the topics, obviously, because it says vocabulary is appropriate to the task, and the task is based on the topic. In my particular example, the topic is probably technology and remote learning. but you could identify another task. Okay, of course, my task is not a real task, so it could differ a little bit. The second tip that I would give would be to learn vocabulary that you can recycle across topics, meaning that you know list of idiomatic expressions, connectives, so words that are helping you to articulate your text that you can reuse on any topics. So you've got to have the learning on the topics that you've covered in lessons, but also some language that allow you to you could use in any topics. Arguably, number two is probably easier to learn. Then you've got also to be able to use complex grammatical structures, meaning that you need to be able to use, for example, in French or in English, relative clauses and put different tenses, how do they work, and use them effectively so they make sense. What's important also is to remember that you need to be able to use that language effectively, and the more effective you will be, the better your mark will be for the language criteria. Um, and you need therefore to train yourself as to make a limited amount of mistakes and check that you make sense. How many students I have tried to help uh, that actually do not have time to proofread their work. Okay, so that's, and sometimes they read it to themselves and then they can't even understand what they've written. So that those are typical mistakes that you can really easily avoid. Then minimize language A interferences. By that I mean if you're an English speaker, make sure you don't use English words in the French paper that you're sitting, because that is a problem when you don't know the vocab. So whenever you've got a doubt, then don't write that word if you're not entirely sure it's a French word. Okay, so the French word for restaurant is restaurant, which is pretty simple, but sometimes some words do not translate directly across. And that works as well for idiomatic expressions. Okay, so it's raining cats and dogs, um, which is an English idiom, is not an acceptable idiom in French. If you translate literally, you cannot translate il pleut des chats et des chiens, because in French you would say il pleut des cordes, which would be it's raining a lot. Okay, so for example, those are the types of things that you need to be sensitive to. So make vocab sets that are specific to each topic for number one. For number two, having a list of connectives and beyond, potentially idiomatic expressions. Um, Make sure that your grammar is up to speed, that you understand what the subjunctive is in French, for instance, or what the conditional tense requires. Okay. Um, Build your proofreading skills, so make sure that you're able to accurately check things, be sensitive to the types of mistakes you're likely to make, and you know you're making all the time when you train to that exam, so you're not going to do it in the exam. And also make sure that you use the language that actually is the intended language, because that's one of very common mistake, and a lot of people lose marks in the exam. Okay, so moving on now to criteria B. Criteria B is about the message relating to the task. So we are looking at the fact that the ideas and content are going to be relevant in the task. So first of all, it's absolutely crucial that you understood the task well, otherwise you will not be able to perform very well in that aspect. And yes, you've got to train yourself to decode, which is going to do a little bit later on. You also have to be sensitive to a couple of elements there. So remember that you've been through a course uh, for 2 years, and you need to use the key ideas and think about the key things that you real life situation that you talked about in lessons that you could be using in your example, but particularly that are relevant in the target culture, meaning the culture you're studying the language of. Second, it's important for you to have a critical sense, meaning that when you're developing your ideas, you're providing details, you're having a critical idea of what maybe that statement is controversial. In the example that we've got, we can see that why is it controversial if languages um, or or basically lessons that were taught in school that are only require perhaps a computer and that's it, then would be taught online and not in school at all. Okay, and what impact would that have had on people? What would be the key thing? So what some people would be thinking that's a good idea, and what some people would think that it's a very bad idea. What would they be? So by being critical is that you're trying to have different standpoints and different point of views. Also, you need to think about the structure, how you're going to present your message to the examiner. And that works for the IB, but actually more generally, even in life. You need to be able to articulate your language in a fashion that will enhance your argumentation. You will make people understand where you're going with those arguments. One of the traps that students often fall into with this is that they start uh, tackling a very interesting argument. They might say, for example, that it might be detrimental for students not to be together in an English lesson because there is a social aspect to learning. Okay, and that's a valid point, and you could give some examples about that. But sometimes students just mention, "Oh, it's good to be together." Then you would not have enough to get a top mark for that because you're not providing details or relevant examples of why that is important. So always think about why. Why is it interesting? Why is it important? And why should we do it? So always ask yourself why. Think about your critical sense. Um, Also, you need to have to be reminded, perhaps, that it's about the course that you've done. So all the things that you've done in the course. If you've got a question about the environment, for instance, then think about all those key things that we talked about the environment during the course. So, what are the key things? What is global warming? How does it work? What are the key issues with that? What are the people who think it's rubbish think? Why is it? Why are they right? Are they wrong? And this is where perhaps your theory of knowledge could come in with your critical sense and understanding. So here are my list of strategies you can place. So learn your key ideas that you have gone over during the course. So make summaries of topics at the end of topics, thinking if there was an essay on this, what should I do or mention about that, regardless of the type of text in that respect. So you could reuse those ideas, and those ideas need to be in the language you're studying, obviously, because sometimes that could lead to some translation issues otherwise. Think about what people would agree or disagree would think. Okay. Remember to use justification and building suitable paragraphs with a main idea in each paragraph, an example, and tell us why, and justification. Some people use uh, point ideas, justification, and examples in each paragraph. So they make sure they've got that for in each one, and therefore you'll produce a text that is balanced and articulated. And also, don't underestimate the importance of rehearsing and knowing the type of texts uh, and what are their purpose. So, as I was mentioning earlier, be careful you're not applying to um, a job by writing a blog. You need to write a formal letter. What does a formal letter look like? What does it need to include? All those things are important to remember because the message ties in with the format. And there is a strong relationship between both. So here on the bottom box, you can see that you need to choose a type of text that is appropriate to the context, purpose, and audience, which means that in every task you will have context, purpose, and audience. Also, the register of a language is whether it is formal, informal, or you don't talk the same way you would talk to your prime minister and the way you would talk to a child that is 5 year old. So it depends uh, how the register is needed with the audience and what does that involve. The response fully incorporates the conventions of the chosen type. So type of text, it means therefore we're going back to that list of text you had at the beginning of the video where you have to include You have to know what a blog involves. What does it have? Usually, a blog has a date, a title, subtitles, sometimes pictures, and also perhaps the tone usually is informal, but sometimes could be formal as well. So some things can fluctuate, but you've got to have some awareness about those. Most of the texts you will have read anyway through your course will fall into the categories of those texts anyway, so you will have come across most of those. But things like a speech or a leaflet, what do they involve? So demonstrate your understanding or that you understand the requirement of each type of text is important. Um, and perhaps you have to make a list, and when you revise, find in your textbook or a list of elements that would correspond for each type of text. And you need to also develop the skill of adapting your language to the task, purpose, and audience. Okay, so take notes during lessons because those are very important aspects in understand to the type of text. Make a list of questions that you could uh, think about, could come up within a particular context. Um, and I would say there, preparing answers and going through, by preparing answers, I'm saying go try to respond the same task in a different type of text. Okay, and you need to rehearse or repeat those uh, skills in different contexts. So try to time yourself, not time yourself. Are you using your resources to give the best possible answer? All those things are very important. They're not particularly linked to the format, but actually they are good things to do in general. Also, should I mention that for the higher, you can see that actually the criteria is the same, and so is for the previous um, criteria. So it's only lang- the language criteria that has got a little bit more uh, a difficult aspect for the higher student. So otherwise, they're pretty much the same. So let's have a look at this task. What I always advise my student to do is also to make sure that they highlight or identify the bits that are the compulsory bit, the bits that give you some ideas about the purpose, the audience, and the purpose. So if you look here, the situation, it's about COVID-19, so the whole crisis. It is about also to deliver only courses online and in a permanent way. So it means we're no longer in that crisis now, but it will continue after. And that's crucial because if you write an essay and you don't talk about the permanent aspect of it, and you're just telling me a story about your COVID-19 experience, then you're not answering what the question asks you to do. So um, he also talks about the lesson that I've not got specific equipment. So you could say that if you write down that in science that would be terrible, then you have not read this carefully because it says uh, specific equipment only. Finally, um, it tells you as well that you're part of the student association and therefore that you need to talk also about the development on teenagers in choosing the following type of text. And we talk about also the impact, which I've not highlighted. So if you're not talking about the impact and the rest, then you will find yourself potentially at risk of actually answering the task but not fully. And that's where you may lose some mark for your criteria B there. Okay. Should I also mention that see that the task is almost it's the same for the higher level. And for criteria A, actually, it is a little bit more advanced. It is something about purposeful use of idiomatic expression and complex structures do not interfere with communication. So it's a little, in other words, if you're doing higher level, the writing is essentially the same as a standard student. However, what will be different uh, it will be slightly harder to achieve those. So On that note, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you've got questions on the things that you have covered in this video, feel free to ask. The exam lasts about an hour and 30 minutes, and you do have a number of tasks, each of them on different area of the topics that you've learned. So best of luck, and tell us if you would like to have other videos like this and you've enjoyed that one. Thanks.